everybody. So today we're going to talk about UV and UVP unwrapping in Cinema 4D and go into some detail about what they are, what they do, and how to unwrap UVs in the software so that you can import files into programs such as Photoshop to create your own textures. UVs are essential for creating good CG and a must-know for every CG artist. We're going to first start out with some terms. UV and UVP definition. UV and UVP are 2 or 3 arbitrary letters that correlate with the term and letters X, Y, Z. They refer to the positional data of textures in 3D space. UV shell, a collection of UV points that are stitched together to form a contiguous body, kind of like a single piece of fabric that is sewn together with other pieces of fabric. A shell is a single body. UV seams, the connection points of one UV shell to another. UV stitching, connecting one UV shell to another. So we could think about making UVs in terms of making clothing. When I look at a shirt, I see islands that are main individual pieces of cloth, and then I have stitch seams which connect those individual pieces of cloth to one another. What I want to do with UVs is separate my 3D model into pieces that are much like those individual pieces of cloth and make them separate islands. Lay them flat on an image and then use that image to edit in Photoshop so that I can have color and texture and paint easily on my model. Next, we're going to look at an example of a good UV and a bad UV. A bad UV is unorganized. We have shapes overlapping each other, and there are certain faces of our model that cannot be reached or colored easily when I bring it into Photoshop. A good UV showcases all faces of our model completely flat on the 2D image. We can reach each UV island with ease, and all sides of our model are unwrapped and flat so that they can be reached in a 2D image. We know exactly where we're painting when we bring this model into Photoshop. Next, we're going to go into Cinema 4D and I will demonstrate how to properly make UVs for a model. Alright guys, here in Cinema 4D I have this really basic model of this wrestler guy. And it's good to first start out with things separated of your model. So I have the torso, I have the legs, I have the hair, and the head as 4 separate objects. And that's a good method to have when working through anything, is to break down something and isolate it so that you can work on it in digestible chunks. So what I'm going to start out by doing is going to this tab that says UV Edit in my layouts and click on it. So as you can see, the UVs for this model have not been unwrapped yet. They're just kind of big blobs of whatever shape that I started with when I was doing this. I was doing box modeling when I created this character, so it's just based off of a cube. So I'm going to start out with this torso. The way that I want to unwrap this torso is by creating 2 shells that are easy to edit in Photoshop, that are the front and the back. So kind of break it down into 2 separate areas. And I'm going to do that by defining my seams. So I'm going to switch to edge mode. And as you can see, it already has some seams, but they're not what I actually want. There's too many pieces and they're in places that I don't want necessarily. So what I'm going to want to do is to go into my projection tab in my UV manager and go to my orthographic view to the front and click on frontal projection. And that's going to give me a base for how I can easily unwrap this character. So now that I have that done, if I look at the UV editor, I can see that I want this front to be separated from the back. So I'm going to do that by defining seams. So right now it does not have any seams on it except for these ends, but it's basically just one shape, and I cannot reach the back of this object without hitting the front first when I go to paint it. So what I'm going to do is create a seam along the edge of the arm that goes all the way around the character to the edge of the torso. And if I go to select there's an option here, and these are really useful, by the way, these component tools. It has loop selection, ring selection, outline selection, fill selection. So what loop selection does, it allows me to select the edge loop of my character. So I'm just going to go to where I want the seam to be there and try to match it up with the seam that is on the upper arm. Now when I select two different seams, I want to shift select. So I want to click the shift button and then click. See, the seam goes all the way across my character to the other arm. And that's what's useful about loop selection, is that you can really get the seams exactly how you want it to be throughout the entire character. So now that I have that defined, I'm going to go to my UV mesh menu, which is here, but also when you click on the UV edit layout, it brings it up right here. And I'm going to click on UV unwrap. So what that's going to do is to split the seams and create shells from the division of the seams. And now if I go back to that useful component menu, I can select fill selection and select one of these shells, and I have this part of the character broken down as its individual shell. And then I'm going to go to my UV mesh menu and click UV transform, and it's going to allow me to move this shell to another part of our UV map. Our UV map is basically this entire square, and that entire square is like an image that you can export into Photoshop. And that's all I need to paint successfully the torso and the back of this character in Photoshop. And I have to be careful with where I place these seams, because I want to strategically place them in places that are not necessarily seen. So the next move I'm going to do is to go to File and click New Texture. And here you can set the texture size. So right now I'm going to set it to 4K square, and it's going to make an image file for this texture. And the next thing I want to do is to go to my layer and click Create UV Mesh from Layer. This will allow my image file to have this UV mesh embedded in it so that I can see my UVs when I edit in Photoshop. And finally, I'm going to save this and go to Save Texture As under File as a PSD. Click OK. I'm going to save that as character texture and open that in Photoshop. So now that I have my Photoshop open, I can see that my UV mesh is a layer inside of this PSD. And I can easily edit it later on. And I could paint whatever textures I have to, such as the creases of the elbow, the belly button, things such as veins, or whatever I need to do. So now that I have the torso completed, I'm going to go on to a different section of the character, such as the head. Now the head is a little bit more complicated. There's parts of it, such as the nose and the mouth, that have to be separated, and this character is wearing a mask, so I have to be careful to separate the mask from the skin. So what I'm going to do with this one, like the last one, is click off and highlight all of my polygons and switch to my orthographic front view and click on frontal mapping. And I'm going to move this kind of into a good position and then go back to my perspective view and make a seam in the back of this character. So I'm going to go to my loop selection and click for a seam straight down the middle of the character. So what I want to do is to have this front be one shell, but have the seam divide maybe halfway. So I'm going to go to my side view and I'm going to deselect these seams here. And now I can kind of peel open this face and have it be laid out flat on my UV texture editor. Next, I'm going to separate parts of this mask from the skin. So it's good if your character has edge loops that are clean, and this is the reason. So if I go to select, I go to loop selection, I can easily select the edge loop that I want for this mask and for the skin. So right about there, and then right about here. And then also in the nose area, there's another separation of mask to skin right there. And right about here. And then I'm going to go to UV mesh, UV unwrap. And there we go. We have a very clean looking shell of my character's face that is easy to paint on in Photoshop. So how I select the shell is to go to select, fill selection, and click on this UV texture editor and go to UV transform, and kind of just clean it up a little bit. I want this to be right side up, and I want these to kind of not be so close to each other, so I can go back to my fill selection, and this is my mouth, so I want that to be moved a little bit to the center here, and maybe change the size so I can paint it easily. And my two eyes here, go back to fill selection and move those around, UV transform. And then I'm going to repeat the process, go to File, New Texture, 4K Texture, OK. Go to Layer, create UV Mesh Layer, and that's going to bring my UVs into the PSD, and then save texture as. So PSD is the best since we can have layers where we can hide out the visibility of our UV layer. And that's about it. All you have to do is repeat the process for the different areas of the character and paint them in Photoshop. And thanks for watching.